I invited my ex to our anniversary party. He walked out and never looked back. I used to think love was the most important thing in a marriage. I thought that if there was love, then it wouldn't matter what you were going through. I thought love was the key to figuring it all out, but that wasn't true. No one ever tells you that love can survive and still not be enough. I had to find it out the hard way. Tobias had never been what you'd call emotional. He was always level-headed. A bit stoic, honestly. It worked then. I told myself it was a balance, that his composure grounded my intensity. I used to tell my friends, half joking, that we were like fire and water, because I burned too easily and he knew just how to cool me off. Together, we just made sense. But now I know that that's not true. The shift started a few months back, I think, when I first brought up our anniversary. It's something we've always marked, even if only quietly. The first year we stayed in, ordered food, and looked at our wedding photos. We hadn't been married for that long, so it made sense to do something quiet and simple. The second, he took me to this little cabin by the lake. We ended up spending the weekend there. It was so peaceful and serene. It was a much-needed escape from the city, and it's probably my favorite anniversary celebration. The third, I surprised him by taking him to a jazz bar downtown because I knew how much he loved jazz and he hadn't discovered the place yet. And last year we went simple again. So just dinner, a bottle of wine, and the kind of easy conversation that brought us together in the first place. So when our 5th anniversary started to approach, I wanted to make it special. 5 years felt like something to celebrate. It was half a decade, a small lifetime packed with each other. I wanted to mark it with more than dinner or a getaway. I wanted to throw an actual party, invite our friends and family, and remind ourselves that we'd built something worth showing off. When I first brought it up to Tobias, it was late evening. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through something on his tablet while I was on the floor folding laundry. I said it like it was just a passing thought, but I could hear the excitement in my own voice. I started talking about doing something bigger that year, a small party with friends and family to celebrate 5 years. He looked up for a second, just long enough for me to notice the slight furrow in his brow, then went back to what he was doing. I remember the way he asked, "A party?" like he wasn't a fan of the idea. So I rushed to make it seem less dramatic. I told him that we could even do it in the backyard or rent a garden space that was close to our house. I even promised that I would do most of the planning and that he wouldn't have to lift a finger. I told him that I thought it would just be nice to have everyone together to celebrate. He didn't reject it, not outright. He just gave this small, polite nod and said, "If that's what you want." And that was it. At the time, I took it as agreement. Tobias wasn't one to get visibly excited about anything, and I told myself not to read too much into it. That was just how he was. I reminded myself that he showed love in quiet ways. He wasn't the kind of man who got animated about parties or really any celebration except the 4th. But as the days went on, I started to notice how little he cared about the whole thing. Normally, even if he wasn't enthusiastic, he'd still ask small questions like, "What are you planning?" or "Who are you inviting?" But after a while, it was just nothing. It was like the conversation never happened. It was to the point where I started to wonder if I'd even suggested it to him in the first place, or if I'd just made it all up in my head. I brought it up again 2 weeks after suggesting it and mentioned that I'd already started looking at venues. Again, he barely glanced up from his laptop when he said, "Whatever you think is best." At first, I told myself he was just busy. His firm had been drowning in new clients, and he'd been putting in extra hours. It wasn't unusual for him to be distracted, especially when things at work got busy. But the more I tried to involve him, the clearer it became that he wasn't distracted. He was completely disinterested. He didn't want to talk about the guest list or help pick out food or music. He didn't even pretend to care about what I was wearing. And it wasn't just passiveness. I could handle Tobias being passive. Hell, he'd been somewhat passive throughout our marriage. But with the party, he was just totally apathetic. I'd sit beside him in the evenings with my laptop open, trying to finalize details, and he'd just scroll through his phone or turn the TV volume up. When I'd ask if something looked good, he'd shrug or mumble something like "sure" or "looks fine" without even looking up. After a while, I stopped showing him anything at all. I didn't get it. I really thought he'd at least be looking forward to it. It had practically become tradition with us, and he couldn't even be bothered to look at the things I'd picked out. It hurt my feelings so much more than I could have imagined. It's strange, honestly, just how much indifference can start to feel like rejection. Him not giving a shit about the anniversary made me feel like he didn't give a shit about me. I caught myself second-guessing everything. I kept wondering if I was being too needy or expecting too much from someone who'd never been expressive to begin with. But then again, hadn't he been different once? Hadn't there been a time when he'd cared enough to make me feel seen or really just make an effort in general? I couldn't decide if he'd changed or if we both had. Still, I threw myself into planning the party. I told myself I was doing it for us, but deep down I started to think that I was doing it just for me, as some weird way to reassure myself and tell myself that we were still worth celebrating, even if Tobias was so distant. I wanted to believe that maybe the atmosphere would remind him of what we'd built together and make him realize that 5 years together was something to get excited over. But as the weeks went by, his indifference didn't soften. If anything, it got even worse. One night, a month before the date, I caught him staring blankly at the TV while I went over the seating chart. I asked him if he thought his sister would be able to make it from out of town, and he just shrugged with his face all screwed up like he was annoyed and said, "I don't know, you can ask her." It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. He was so dismissive and rude. I knew I could have asked her myself, but I also knew that she'd be more willing to come if he asked her. But that didn't matter to him. He just waved me off like I wasn't important. After that, I stopped trying to get him on board. I stuck to making the arrangements myself and handling every little detail in silence. If he noticed, he didn't say. It was like planning a celebration for someone who didn't want to be celebrated. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at him when he wasn't looking, as I tried to figure out if something deeper was wrong. Was he unhappy with me? With our marriage? Or was he really just averse to the idea of a party? Would he want something simpler? The irony is, the more distant he became, the more desperate I was to bridge the gap. I told myself that once the party happened and he saw how much effort I put in, he'd remember what we had. I clung to the idea that it just wasn't his thing, and that as the date got closer, he would eventually start to see why I wanted to celebrate, and he would appreciate me more. I held on to that desperately because admitting that Tobias might not care anymore was too terrifying to face. It all got out of hand one night, though. I hadn't meant for it to turn into a fight. I just couldn't keep swallowing the tension anymore. The air between us had grown thick, and I couldn't pretend like I didn't notice anymore. So I confronted him about it. We had just finished dinner, and we were both sitting at the dining table when I finally said, "Tobias, can we talk about the anniversary?" I wish I said it with anger or just some more conviction, but my voice came out soft. He sighed and then took a long sip from his water, like he wanted to put off the conversation for as long as possible. Then he asked, "What about it?" I asked him if he wanted to go over some more details since he wasn't working, and the date was getting closer. He practically rolled his eyes, and he looked at me like he was beyond irritated. Then he said, "Do we really need to make this a whole thing? It's just an anniversary?" That stung like crazy, and my voice broke when I said, "Just an anniversary?" Then he actually did roll his eyes, and he rubbed his temple like I was giving him a headache. "You know what I mean? I just don't see the point in spending all this money for something performative." Performative. The word hung between us like an accusation. I couldn't believe that he was acting like that and saying those things, so I told him that I wasn't doing it to perform, and that 5 years mattered to me, and it should matter to him too. He was quiet after that. Not because my words sunk in or anything, but because he just didn't feel like responding. That made me start to tear up. My eyes were watery when I said that I just needed to know if he even wanted to go through with it anymore, and that he was always acting like I was forcing him. He scoffed and told me that he wasn't acting like anything, and that was when I said, "That's exactly the problem." My voice was too quiet, because I knew that I would burst into tears if I yelled. "You're not acting like anything. You don't care, you don't ask, you don't even look interested." I couldn't even finish what I was saying before he blew up at me and said that I always had to make everything dramatic and turn everything into some big emotional performance. He said that I was exhausting and that it was an anniversary, not a national holiday. I was shaking with tears when I told him that I was doing it because it was important to me, because I wanted to celebrate us, and because I loved him. But he wasn't fazed by my tears. He looked at me like he was almost bored. He sighed and said, "Isn't it enough they were already married? Not everything has to be so sentimental." Then he just got up and walked away. He left his dishes on the table and me sitting there crying like a fool. We didn't patch things up after that. There was no apology, no attempt to talk it out. Just silence. I thought about canceling it more times than I could count. The idea of standing in front of friends and family, pretending we were happy, felt unbearable. But I'd already told everyone. My parents had booked their flights, his sister had cleared her schedule, and most of the vendors had all been paid deposits. Calling it off would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer, so I kept planning. I picked out decorations and tasted cakes and smiled through conversations with planners, all while wondering if my husband still loved me, or if he'd just decided that loving me was too much work. Time passed and things with Tobias and I were still stilted. We only when necessary and never about the party. It was awful, and being at home with him felt almost painful. So I found excuses to leave, to run errands and stay out longer than I needed to. That's how I ended up at the decor store one afternoon, standing in front of a shelf lined with candle holders. I was supposed to be picking out centerpieces for the tables. At first, I wanted to get things that were as close to the ones we had when we'd gotten married. But standing there staring at the shelves, I wasn't so sure I needed a reminder of how bad things had gotten. I was just about to pick out some random ones when I heard my name, and I couldn't believe who it was when I turned around. It was my ex, Jasper. He looked almost the same, just a little older, more mature, but unmistakably him. His hair was shorter than I remembered, and his jaw slightly more defined, but his smile was the same. It was exactly like I remembered. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. We were both so shocked to see each other. I hadn't thought about Jasper in years, not really. Every now and then, his name would drift through my mind. Maybe if I saw a restaurant we used to love, or heard a song that he liked, but it had always been in a distant, abstract way. I never thought I'd actually see him again. And yet, there he was. We talked for a few minutes in the aisle, and the conversation was light and awkward at first, which wasn't surprising. It had been almost a decade since the last time I saw him. A decor store was hardly the best place to catch up, but I couldn't help the many questions I kept asking him. He told me he'd moved back to the city 2 years ago, and that he'd been meaning to reach out to old friends but hadn't known where to start. I don't know why, but seeing him made me feel good. He reminded me of an old part of myself, like a past life, and he was still such a charming, happy person. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling just as wide as him. After a few minutes, I realized we were standing there talking like old friends in the middle of the store, probably blocking the way for people who were trying to get past. So I laughed and asked if he was free and wanted to get lunch so we could really catch up. It was so reflexive. I didn't even have to think about it. The words just came out of me. And he hesitated for only a second before he said yes. We ended up at a small restaurant just down the street. We picked a spot near the window, and for a moment, it almost felt like no time had passed at all. We talked about everything and nothing. It was so easy to be with him and speak to him, and I knew exactly why. Jasper wasn't like my other exes. We didn't break up because of something dramatic or unforgivable. We broke up because his mom got sick and he had to move back home and take care of her. We'd broken up amicably and peacefully, and it had hurt like hell because I still loved him with everything in me. We tried to make it work those first few months after the move, but the distance and things with his mom made it too hard. Jasper was, in a way, the one that got away from me. I asked him to tell me about his life after moving away, and he told me about how it had been taking care of his mother after she got sick, and about how hard that time had been. He told me how she'd passed 2 years after the move, and how after she died, he'd felt like he couldn't just up and leave. He had to stay and grieve with his family before he could think of rebuilding his life. He also told me about how he'd used the money from what his mom had left him to open an antique shop. It was something that his mom always wanted to do, but never got the chance, and he didn't really know what to do with himself, so he thought, why not? He made plans to open it with his sister, and she'd been the one managing it before he moved back to the city for good. At some point, the conversation turned toward me. He asked what had brought me to the decor store, and when I told him I was shopping for my anniversary, he raised his brows a little. It was obvious he was surprised. So I told him that I'd been married for 5 years now, and saying that out loud felt heavier than I expected. He congratulated me. He was polite and kind about it, the way he always was. He asked why I was getting the candle holders myself, and I told him that I wanted a personal touch on each table. It sounded cheesy the second I said it, but he just smiled and said that it made sense, and he'd always known I was sentimental like that. We sat there for a while after that, catching up on the years we'd missed. It was strange. There was this familiar and distant feeling at the same time. Talking to him felt like opening a window that had been shut for years. When it was time to go, he insisted on paying, and before he left, he tore a piece of paper from a notepad and scribbled down his number and the address of his shop. "You should stop by sometime," he said. "Antique shops are great places to find stuff for an anniversary. Besides, I don't want us to lose touch again." I slipped the paper into my purse, told him I'd think about it. He smiled at me, and then he was gone. I sat there for a while after he left, partly because I didn't want to go home just yet, but mostly because I was replaying the whole thing in my head. And days later, I still couldn't stop thinking about him. The napkin sat in my nightstand. I didn't save number. I just shoved it into my drawer the second I got home. All I could do was think about it even after days had passed. I wanted to keep talking to Jasper. I wanted to see him again. But calling him or going to the shop felt like crossing some line. Meanwhile, things with Tobias only got worse. We barely spoke. And when we did, it usually spiraled into sharp arguments about every little thing. Everything I said seemed to irritate him, and everything he did seemed to disappoint me. It wasn't even the fights themselves that hurt. It was the way he looked through me afterward. It was almost like I was just another obligation he'd grown tired of fulfilling. One night, after an especially pointless argument about who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning, I sat on the edge of the bed long after he'd gone to sleep, and I couldn't help but wonder why I was keeping myself from stepping over that line when Tobias insisted on acting the way he did. I started to rationalize things and tell myself that there was nothing wrong with reconnecting with an old friend, and I really did need more things for the anniversary. So the next morning I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and drove to Jasper's shop. The antique store was tucked into a quiet street lined with trees, and its front windows cluttered with old lamps, framed art, and a bunch of little trinkets. Jasper looked up from behind the counter when I walked in, and it was like his whole face lit up when he said, "You came." I smiled and tried to play it casual. "You said to stop by," was what I told him. His smile didn't dim as he wiped his hands on a rag and came around the counter. For a second, it almost looked like he was going to pull me in for a hug, but then thought better of it and tucked his hands into his pockets. "I didn't think you actually would. Most people say that and never do." "Well," I said as I glanced around the shop, "I'm not most people." "No, you aren't," he said, and I don't know, there was just this way that he said it. Like he meant so much more than just his words. I blushed harder than I should have and ignored how my stomach fluttered. I distracted myself from it by taking a look around the place. It was beautiful in its own way, dim but cozy and filled with very eccentric pieces. He joined me eventually, and we walked together through the aisles. He told me about where most of the items came from, and about how his sister was the one who mainly chose what they would stock up. When he wasn't looking, I found myself staring him. I couldn't stop looking at the lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't there before, or the way he smiled with his whole face. It wasn't attraction, not at first. It was a strange kind of longing, and a grief for what could have been. We ended up talking for hours again. Time just seemed to fly by when I was with him, like old times. At one point, he showed me an old photo frame he thought would be perfect for a wedding picture, and without even thinking, I laughed and said, "Not sure I have many of those worth framing lately." He didn't press, though, just gave me a quiet look and nodded like he understood. When I finally left the shop, the sun was already low, and I found myself wanting to go right back inside. I sat in my car for a long time afterward, unsure what I was doing. I told myself it was harmless, that there was nothing wrong with seeing an old friend, and that I wasn't looking for anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Something about being in Jasper's presence made me feel awake again. When I was back at the house with Tobias, it was like there was this storm cloud over my head. I felt dull and upset constantly, but with Jasper, I felt alive. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd laughed as hard as I did when I was with him. I knew I couldn't go back, that I shouldn't. But the more I stayed in Tobias's presence and tolerated his disdain, the more I craved the escape that Jasper provided. When I eventually went back again, I told myself I was just going to look around, that I needed a few more things for the anniversary setup, some interesting decor pieces, or maybe a frame or two for the photo table my mom suggested. But even as I parked outside Jasper's shop, I knew that wasn't really why I was there. The excuse was easy to reach for. Believable even. I'd been running around for days getting everything together for the party. What was one more stop? But the truth was simpler and far less reasonable. I wanted to see him again. I wanted that calm I felt sitting across from him at lunch. That was it. The bell over the door chimed like it did the last time as I stepped inside. The place was just as cluttered, and in the middle of it all was Jasper. He was standing in front of some boxes, frowning with his hands folded. He didn't notice me until I got closer, and when he did, he smiled. His hey was soft and welcoming. I asked what he was doing, and he told me that he had to sort through some things that his sister had sent, decide what to sell and what was too damaged, but didn't know where to start. So I offered to help him, and he smiled even wider. We sat down together in the middle of all the boxes and tried to sort them out, but the whole time I kept glancing toward him. He looked so at home there, in the shop. There was this ease to him that I hadn't felt in years. I was almost jealous. We talked about so many random things as we went through box after box. It shouldn't have been fun. Sorting boxes was hardly an exciting activity, but with him it was. We talked and laughed, and in those moments it was easy to pretend like this was how our lives had turned out, like he'd never moved, and like Tobias wasn't back home. That should have been the last time I went, but it ended up being the first of many. Over the course of a week, I found reasons to stop by again and again. I told myself it was about the party and about finding the right touches to make it feel special, and I ignored the fact that I rarely ever left the shop with any purchase. Each time I went, I'd end up staying longer than I planned. Jasper would show me something new, an intricate mirror or a weirdly shaped clock, and we'd take the time to look at it and the next thing, and the next. And those moments stretched into hours. We fell into a rhythm like we'd never lost touch at all. Sometimes we'd grab coffee afterward or a quick bite from this cafe down the street. The conversations were easy, full of small jokes and shared looks that made everything else fade for a while. Once we spent our entire time together coming up with backstories for each item and some of the random photos that came with the old frames. He would always walk me to my car afterwards, and he would always linger just a bit too long, and it scared me just how natural it felt. When I was with him, the constant tightness in my chest just loosened. He made space for me to breathe. There wasn't any pressure to say the right thing or hold myself together. I didn't feel judged or invisible. I didn't have to tiptoe around my own emotions like I sometimes did with Tobias. One evening, I stopped by the shop after work. He was in the back, rearranging a shelf, and when he saw me, he smiled like he always did. I'd had another argument with Tobias earlier that day, and seeing him instantly made me feel better, but I was still pretty upset. He noticed right away, but he didn't ask. He just led me into the office in the back so I could sit down, and maybe it was the look on his face, the way he seemed so concerned and worried, or maybe it was the weight of everything I'd been trying to hold in, but suddenly it all started coming out. I told him I was tired and that sometimes it felt like I was the only one trying. I told him everything, about the big fight with Tobias and all the little ones that followed after. I told him about how bad things were between us. I told him all of it. And then I said, half joking but not really, that maybe I should just call the whole thing off and stop pretending like we were fine. He told me he didn't think I was being too much or unreasonable, and that from what I'd told him, I'd done everything right. He said that Tobias should be the one reaching out, not me. Hearing that shouldn't have meant so much to me. But they did. Because for once, someone was on my side. Completely. The way he said it made something twist inside me. I don't know if it was gratitude or if maybe his words just freed me up to think about myself for once. I looked up and realized how close he was sitting. The air between us felt thin in that moment, and I could feel his breath when he exhaled. There wasn't any real thought before it happened, no plan or weighing of consequences. 1 second I was looking at him, the next I was kissing him. He froze for half a second, like he wasn't sure what to do, but then he kissed me back. Passionately and desperately, like he'd been wanting to do it for as long as I had. The rest of the world just disappeared for a bit, and I remember the way he pulled me closer, the way he put his hands in my hair. We got a little handsy after a while. It was clumsy and desperate. It was great. When we eventually pulled apart, we were breathing hard and we were both stunned into silence. There was this unspoken understanding between us that we'd just crossed a line. But regret didn't come, not then at least. Instead, there was this strange calm. Like for the first time in a long time, something made sense, even if it shouldn't have. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, and I don't even know who leaned in first that time, but we kissed again. The guilt came in slowly at first. It kind of creeped up on me. For the first day or two after the kiss, I tried to convince myself that it wasn't as serious as it felt. It was just a kiss. A stupid, impulsive moment. Something that didn't have to mean anything if I didn't let it. But then the guilt truly settled in me, and my stomach got all knotted up, and I started to feel terrible. I didn't go back to Jasper's shop after that night. I told myself it was to keep things simple, to draw a line and move on. But the truth was, I didn't trust myself to see him again. So I stayed busy. I threw myself into the last-minute details for the party, and I told my family everything was going smoothly, even though Tobias seemed so far away. I acted like everything was fine, but then at night, when I was alone, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder what kind of person cheats on their husband right before throwing a celebration for their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jasper didn't reach out either, at least not for the first few days. Then one afternoon, I got a message from him that said, "Please talk to me. I hope you're okay." I stared at it for a long time before deleting his number without replying. And then came the panic and this voice in my head that kept telling me that I had to come clean before someone else did. That it was better to tell him myself than to risk him finding out another way. And that maybe if I told him the truth, he'd understand. But I knew the truth. Tobias wasn't the type to forgive something like that. I knew it. I'd seen the way he shut down when people disappointed him. He didn't explode or lash out. He just iced you out until you didn't exist anymore. He prided himself on control and on always being the reasonable one. The night before the party, I tried to reach out again. I put my hand on his chest and I asked him if he could wear the pocket square that matched my dress. A small thing, really, stupid even. But I thought it would look nice in the photos. He sighed, said something about it being unnecessary, and that nobody cared about those details but me. I tried to explain and told him it mattered to me, that I wanted everything to look put together, but he rolled his eyes, muttered under his breath, and then said, "God, you're so dramatic sometimes." He'd said it before, so it shouldn't have hurt as much, but it did. That night, lying in bed beside him, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. Couldn't stop thinking about how I'd gotten there. 5 years of marriage, and I was about to throw a party for a relationship that felt like a ghost of itself. I'd spent weeks obsessing over tablecloths and flower arrangements, all to celebrate a love that, if I was honest, didn't even feel alive anymore. And to make it worse, I'd gone and kissed another man. I had no idea what to do. I thought of driving away that night. I wasn't even sure where I would go. I just wanted to get away. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't disappoint everyone like that. The party came faster than I was ready for. Everything was set up in the small hall a few blocks away from the house. It was filled with lights and flowers and a playlist that I curated just for Tobias. Everyone was smiling and laughing. My parents were chatting with his, and everyone seemed happy. Everyone except me, really. They were all enjoying the product of my hard work and suffering, and none of them knew what I'd had to go through to get everything together. Tobias looked good that night, of course. He always did. He wore the suit I'd picked out, though not the pocket square. I think he may have done that just to spite me. He moved through the crowd like he belonged there, shaking hands and thanking people for coming just like I was. From the outside, we looked like the perfect couple, but I knew it was all fake. He smiled for the photos, leaned in when people were watching, but the space between us still felt enormous. I kept hoping nobody else could feel it, that the night would just pass smoothly and then it would all be over with. So I tried to keep busy. I was moving around that hall like I wasn't the one being celebrated. I just didn't want to think, so I tried to distract myself. And it worked for a while, but then I saw him. Jasper. He was standing near the entrance, looking slightly out of place in the crowd of overdressed family members. For a moment, my mind just blanked, and I thought I was seeing things. I'd completely forgotten that I'd invited him weeks ago, before everything happened. My heart dropped straight to my stomach. I excused myself from whoever I was talking to and rushed over to him. He smiled when he saw me, but it was obvious he was nervous. I could barely breathe. Before he could say anything, I told him that he shouldn't have come and that it wasn't a good time for him to be there. He frowned, confused, and said, "You invited me." I know, but things are complicated right now, okay?" I said quickly, and I tried to push him toward the door, but he wouldn't move. I told him that he needed to go, but he refused. "I can't," he said quietly. "Not until we talk." "Talk?" My voice cracked as I asked. "About what happened," he said. His voice was low but firm. "You've been ignoring me. I just need to know where we stand. We need to talk about that kiss." I didn't want to deal with that or discuss the kiss, especially not at the party, so I was just about to tell him that there was nothing to talk about when I heard another voice behind me. "What kiss?" It was Tobias. I knew that instantly, and hearing his voice made my blood run cold. The hall wasn't big. I'd purposely chosen a small one so Tobias wouldn't feel overwhelmed, and now it had come back to bite me. His face was unreadable when I turned around, but his posture was stiff. He looked from Jasper to me, then back again, and I could tell that he recognized him. I'd told him about Jasper when we'd just started dating, and I know he'd seen old pictures of us together in an old album or something. He knew exactly who Jasper was. "Tobias," I started, but my throat felt way too tight. "This isn't what it sounds like." He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on me. He looked normal. To anyone else, he would have looked totally fine, but I'd been married to him for years. I knew when he was furious. "What kiss?" he repeated, this time a lot sharper. I tried to reach for him, to get him to move somewhere private, but he didn't budge. His voice stayed calm, even when I begged him to go outside and to talk somewhere else. I begged him not to do anything too harsh and for us to go outside, but he wasn't listening. "Then answer me," he said. "Did you kiss him?" His voice grew a bit louder, and I started to panic. Jasper was frozen beside me, guilt written all over his face. There was no way out. There was only one thing to do. "Yes," I said finally. My voice was so small I was surprised he could hear me. "But it meant nothing." Tobias looked like he was ready to laugh, so I rushed to say more, to say anything that could convince him that it was true. "I love you," I said desperately. "I swear to you it was a mistake. I've been planning this party for weeks because I love you, because I wanted to make us feel right again, but this was just a mistake." He stared at me like I was something he couldn't quite recognize. "You wanted to celebrate us by kissing someone else?" The way he said it made me feel like Jay was pathetic. I tried to continue, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. It made me feel unimportant all over again. "God," he said under his breath, shaking his head. "I should have trusted myself. I've been put off by you for months now. The way you nag, the way you turn everything into some performance, just how excessive everything has to be with you." I flinched at his words. They almost physically hurt. He continued and told me that now he knew that I was making up for sneaking around by planning all of this bullshit, and that I'd put on a show to cover up the fact that I was seeing another man. I begged him. I pleaded with him to just let me explain and to just listen to me, but he cut me off with a sharp, cold laugh. "You know what? I'm thankful for this. Really, because now I don't have to wonder anymore. I don't have to pretend I love you when I don't." When he said that, it felt like my heart broke in my chest. He looked at me one last time. His face was full of disgust, and said quietly, "Enjoy your party." And then he turned and walked out. I stood there frozen, with my face hot and wet with tears. I didn't even remember when I'd started to cry. Everyone had watched us, and now they were all watching me cry and get left behind by my husband. That night was the last time I saw Tobias. It's been weeks since then. Tobias never came back to the house. I got a call from his lawyer about 2 weeks after the party, and then another call from mine. He wanted a divorce. He'd already started the whole process and wanted nothing to do with me. And Jasper hasn't called since then. Not once. I don't blame him. After the way I panicked that night, the way I'd totally denounced him and said he didn't matter. It's not surprising he'd want nothing to do with me, too. My family's disappointed, though they don't say it outright. My mother keeps telling me to take some time to reflect, which is her polite way of saying that I did this to myself. And she's right, I did. Now I'm alone, more alone than I ever was when Tobias and I were fighting. It's almost funny in a way. I spent weeks planning a party to celebrate our love, and by the end of it, I'd managed to destroy it completely.